Okay, so I'm sure all of you have been thinking about empathy and use it in your work all the time. And if any country needed empathy at the present moment, it's the UK. This is a very obvious definition. I like Roman Krasnarik's work. I find him very personable. And the notion of stepping imaginatively into somebody else's shoes is probably how most people, in euphemistic ways, describe empathy. But obviously, as you know, all of you, which I'm sure you do, empathy has two basic components, an affective component and a cognitive component. Baron Cohen, in his work on 0 degrees of empathy, argues there isn't really anybody in the world who doesn't experience empathy. He argues that autistic children have quite a lot of affective empathy rather than an account of theory of mind. Obviously, it differs in different cases. Where psychopaths, and he argues only 2% of the world fit the definition of psychopaths, have much more cognitive empathy than affective empathy. That means they know how you feel, they just don't really care. There's lots of accounts of empathy. I wanted to recommend this book by the HRC, which sums up about 70 projects that deal with art and design and empathy. It's free online and from the HRC, and it's a very useful discussion. I particularly like the work that covered prison, and so I wanted to mention that to you. It's really obvious to most of you who use user-centered design that empathy with users is very straightforward and well known. For our own centre, which is the Design Against Crime Research Centre, when we first started out, we wanted to talk about empathy not just with users, but with misusers and abusers. I'd taken down the life story of a professional thief, and we've always included the voices of criminals and victims in our work, because crime is a complex problem. And I think that by extending the account of empathy to understand misuse and abuse, it actually gives you a systems account of how to approach the subject. Now, one of the key texts that I was given when I was thinking about this subject a long time ago was this one here, which is on the notion of how to understand user-centered design. And it's really an obvious and quite old hat approach now, which is associated with the IDEO. And I don't mean that it's not a useful and significant contribution to the world, but I'm sure most of you know about it, so I won't go on too much. But it's the idea that we use qualitative research to inform and inspire designers to create more useful and enjoyable things for people that they may never meet. And there seem to be 4 phases: discovery, immersion, connection, and detachment. These are straightforward: discovery, entering the user's world; immersion, wandering around. I mean, I've always been very fascinated by the life stories of police officers who enter somebody else's world undercover, have children with them, and then eventually leave in the most morally dubious ways. The connection of rationalising with the user and then detaching is what I'm also interested in. It's something I'm going to come back to in this talk. So, Design Against Crime have been very interested not just in designing with empathy, but designing for empathy. And we think that that's a much less commercial or solution-orientated role for empathy, to design not just with but for empathy, although they're pretty interchangeable. So I wanted to try and provide some context of how we as a design centre got into this discussion. So again, you're probably all aware of Barack Obama's famous account of the empathy deficit, which has been defined as contributing to a social divide when empathy is not recognised and celebrated as an essential mental habit that should inform human action. And just reading my Facebook account, for those who voted for and against Brexit, really it's important that we try to understand each other. Jeremy Rifkin is also quite well known for his account of the empathetic civilization. And, both of these writers are making the case about building empathy, the need to do that. Rifkin suggests capitalism and the pursuit of materialism and individualism stunts empathy and fostering more of it could help bring people together to solve global problems. But, like most of the accounts I've read, none of them seem able to measure or explain exactly how increased empathy will make a difference or lead to political change. And it's really important, I think, that we do understand how that might happen. I'm not sure I've got the answers, but I've started to think about it. And I've mentioned Baron Cohen already, but his clinical work on autism and psychopathology suggests that only 2% of the population experience what he describes as 0 degrees of empathy. And there are all those, Hollywood accounts of psychopath that his writing suggests are overdetermined, because actually a lot of work from neuroscience too, which you can find on the Extending Empathy Network, suggests that actually even with those that have been diagnosed as psychopathic, there is the potential to build empathy. But Obama's point is that we need to take opportunities to build more empathy in the remaining 98% of the population. And so that's why I started to engage with Roman Kisnarik, who's led debates for the Royal Society of the Arts. You may have seen his lectures. They're very well illustrated. And I enjoyed his book on empathy, which argues the need to mobilise cooperation and imagination in order to develop more aptrospection between individuals, as well as empathetic experiences. But if I have a critique of Roman's work, it's that he is from the School of Life, and again the account is very individualistic, and we're caught as often design activists in trying to move beyond the individual to the collective. So what to do about that is something I'd like to talk about. But before I do that, I wanted to sort of try and locate how, as designers, that we've come to look at empathy things. And we take Binder's from the Atelier project definition of empathy things as those socio-material assemblies that deal with events and other matters of concern. And I think it's really important that the notion of an object and an assembly being one and the same thing in language that's been lost is something to go back to and to look at. And for us in our centre, empathy things are those things that foster empathy between people. And I differentiate between an individual empathetic insight to a collective empathy experience, and I'll try and talk a bit more about that. So I think that probably the earliest work I could find in design that was significant is Patricia Moore's work, dressing up as a senior and using all the props to engage with different experiences that informed her account of universal design. I'm sure that most of you know that Patricia Moore, at the age of 20-odd, dressed up as an 80-year-old woman or an 82-year-old woman and spent 2 years in drag figuring out why it's so difficult for seniors to use certain objects, particularly in public space. And I became, as I often do, quite interested in the actual objects that she used to create that experience. She talked about being made over by a Hollywood cosmetics person who did the makeup and the hair, but I'm quite interested in what else she used, and I started to think about that a lot. And Adam and I have worked collectively on design for social innovation that often creates objects and experiences really to try and produce empathetic encounters, and that's something I hope you're going to talk a bit more about. I've recently been working with Claire Patey and Roman Kisnarik on the Empathy Museum. If you're interested, the Empathy Museum is currently, it's a pop-up located at North Greenwich. I'll talk a bit more about that, but it's the first pop-up space that's designed to find ways to engage with the public, to use things and performative objects to help inspire more public understanding of the importance of empathy. And the first experience that Claire created was called A Mile in My Shoes. Claire's a participatory artist, and the Vauxhall Expo was a great big shoebox. You go in, you get somebody else's shoes that you put on. They've got lots of sizes, and a tape recorder, and you march down the river listening to somebody's story. And when I first did that, I wasn't sure if it was really an experience that provoked empathy or voyeurism. And I felt like I was listening to the radio. And so I started to engage, and that's how I've agreed to be on their board. But the latest output of the Empathy Museum is another pop-up, which is located at Canary Wharf next to the Shoebox, which is a library. And you can go in and take out a book, and the inspiration is that is to share, those things that moved you. And so, if you're interested, you go in, you read a description of a book, but you don't know what the book's called. You get a number. You can take a book. You can take the book away and keep it if you want. And the library's been crowdfunded, and the ambition is to get those who find the book on a bench to pass it on, but also to engage with the website, to create a debate about empathy and the experience it generates. But there are many projects. The one that astonished me at first, because I come from a big family and I can't imagine not being around babies, was the Ruth of Empathy project that started in Canada, which is an evidence-based classroom program that takes babies into the classroom and gets the kids in the classroom to talk about what the baby's feeling, how the baby might be responding. And those schools that have engaged with this project, and it's in significant numbers now, argue that they have less problems in the school, less conflict problems because of that. You probably all heard of the human library concept, where they were set up to promote tolerance, where a group of human books could be taken out by the public, and they would be on stigmatized subjects. So, basically for the Students' Union, you might have, a Brexit voter, or a Muslim mother, or a lesbian lesbian mother. We did one for the human, called the Human Graffiti Library, because the team had found that it was very difficult between the stakeholders that we engaged with to actually generate real dialogue. That what we found is people didn't listen to each other, there were lots of prejudice. So we set up a human graffiti library at Central St Martin's, and we got all our colleagues to be books that got taken out. And what we found was that, so the reader is the person that chooses the book, and the librarian is the person that ensures that the book is returned in the same emotional state that they started out with. And what we found was, between police officers and so-called vandals that I call artists, there was a dialogue that hadn't happened before, and they have met and talked since. And that's very helpful, we felt, in building community. I don't know if you know about the Blind Cafe, I'm sure that you do. I once went there with some colleagues where you go in and you're escorted in the dark, and you taste food in the dark, and you experience what it might like to be not to be sighted. I was very interested in this project, Be My Eyes, because this project gets individuals to work with those who are not sighted, to help them if they're not sure what can they're taking out of the cupboard. And I found this project to be more interesting because of the engagement between people rather than the individual introspection that some of the experiences may produce. The Parent Circle, which is the Family Forum, is a joint Palestinian and Israeli organisation where, those that have lost children counsel each other despite the divide. It seems to have produced really, really good things. And I, again, think that's a very interesting empathy project. Forgiveness project, very similar project, where those that have been very, very badly treated by the world. There was one woman whose daughter was stabbed to death by another girl in her class. She chose, rather than become bitter and unable to cope, that she would try to mother the girl who stabbed her daughter. And her marriage broke up because her husband couldn't find the forgiveness in him, and the project promotes various approaches to forgiveness. And empathy is very central to that project. So all of those social innovations, designs, services that I've just described talk about empathy. But how is designing with empathy different from designing for empathy? I thought I knew, but I'm not sure I do completely. And Adam and I have discussed it, and we think we're there, but there's something that we're opening up to you. That's the point of having a workshop. So if you take an empathy suit, and the usual suit you see is the Agnes suit that's used by designers to feel what it might be like to be a senior. So to design for empathy, do you need to engage with the thing and someone else? Or are the things simply the conduits that enabled user-centered design to happen for designers to design with empathy? If you put on a suit and you don't engage with anybody, you have the introspection. Is it different if you put on a suit and engage with people who experience, I suppose, fat discrimination? And there are objects out there that seem to be able to facilitate both approaches. There's an empathy toy that enables people to, introspect, but also engage with others in terms of how the game is played. And I found these projects interesting, but our reflection is that it appears that design for and with empathy always have a connection and cannot easily be separated. Is it that we design with empathy for the other, and we design for empathy with the other? And that strikes us as probably true, but we're not sure. So the reason that we wanted to engage today is to see what the case studies and you think. Both types of design I'm describing may build empathy, but for whom and for what end? Both may lead to greater understanding and even deliver a prequel stage of a person wanting to change. Is it possible that design things could increase empathy and play a role in conflict management or act as a prequel to transformational change? I've just been with a group of restorative practitioners from the world, and they think that, some of them, not all of them, think that proxy processes are not really quite right. They think the victim and the criminal of the actual crime have to come together. But if your criminal is dead, how do you do that? And so I'm very interested in what the potential for empathy things is. And to get to the end, it seems to me that empathy things could be used by individuals who know they want to change but need help. For example, restorative justice, as I've just mentioned, suggests that direct contact between victims and perpetrator is what needs to happen to produce sort of justice from below. But it seems to me that there are many ways of experiencing what happened. There is many ways of experiencing empathy, and maybe things have a role to play in the future. So I'd like to now hand over to our contributors, our protagonists, to talk about their empathy things and ask them to perhaps outline some of the qualities that they see in the things they're going to describe. Thank you.